Alex Alava for Rebel News, and at the time of recording this report, it is Sunday afternoon. Only few hours have passed since a major military operation was carried out in Jalisco, Mexico. A bilateral operation between Mexico and the United States that reportedly led to the capture, but also to the death of the head of the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, better known as El Mencho. His real name is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, 59 years old, a former police officer who turned a drug kingpin. He led a vast criminal organization responsible for trafficking massive quantities of drugs, not only in the United States, but also in Canada and other countries, in addition to the human trafficking, extortion, and other violent crimes. CJ&G is now considered one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico, a direct rival of the Sinaloa cartel, from which it split in 2010 before experiencing rapid expansion. Washington had offered up to $15 million for information leading to El Mencho's capture. But the situation is far from stabilized. In the hours following the announcement of his capture and his death, retaliatory acts broke out a little bit everywhere in Mexico. Vehicles were set on fire, roads were blocked, Guadalajara airport was reportedly targeted. The U.S. Department of State even issued a shelter-in-place advisory for American citizens in Jalisco state, as well as other parts of Mexico. So what does this operation mean? To discuss this, I'm joined by Jérôme Blanchet-Gravel, editor-in-chief of Libre Média, who is currently in Mexico and is also an expert in Latin American politics.
Entonces, regresar a la guerra contra el narco no es opción. No es opción. Primero, porque está fuera del marco de la ley. Todos estos de la derecha que se llenan la boca de las palabras Estado de Derecho y defienden la guerra contra el narco, pues la guerra contra el narco está fuera de la ley, porque como lo dije o lo he dicho en varias ocasiones, es permiso para matar, sin ningún juicio. Y eso en México nadie o muy poquitos están de acuerdo. Está fuera del marco de la ley. Y segundo, no sirvió de nada más que para aumentar los homicidios en México y el nivel de violencia. Entonces, estos llamados autoritarios, porque son autoritarios, es ir hacia el fascismo.
Well, it wasn't meant to be, and we're very friendly with her. She's a good woman, but the cartels are running Mexico. She's not running Mexico. The cartels are running Mexico. And we could be politically correct and be nice and say, oh, yes, she is. No, she's very, she's very frightened of the cartels. They're running Mexico. And I've asked her numerous times, would you like us to take out the cartels? No, Mr. President. No, please. So we have to do something because we lost. The real number is 300,000 people, in my opinion. They like to say 100,000. 100,000 is a lot of people, but the real number is 300,000 people. And we lost it to drugs, and they come in through the southern border, mostly the southern border. Plenty come in through Canada, too, by the way, in case you don't know. But they come in through the southern border, and something's going to have to be done with Mexico.
Yes, well, the situation is still unfolding, so there's a lot of distortion and misinformation circulating. Mexicans, depending on where they live, are obviously concerned, but they're also somewhat used to this kind of operation. That said, this appears to be a historic operation, because we're talking about someone who allegedly operated with impunity for about 20 years, likely the head of what is considered the most powerful cartel in Mexico. What's important to understand is that the narcos are not involved only in drug trafficking, but also in human trafficking. One of the satellite branches of this cartel reportedly developed that side of operations, smuggling migrants across the U.S. border. And it's important to remind listeners, this is absolutely not a conspiracy theory. We're also talking about child trafficking and organ trafficking. These are notorious criminals. They're not just the kind of outlaw gangsters you see dramatized in Netflix series. They are slave drivers, involved in forced labor, sexual slavery, and more. So this is seen as good news for security in Mexico. What has just emerged is that there was official cooperation with the United States under Trump. It's reasonable to think the Trump administration played a major role in this historic operation. We know Donald Trump has been developing what some describe as a new Monroe Doctrine. This comes just weeks, even months, after the capture of Maduro. Trump has been putting pressure across the Americas to strengthen U.S. security. Fentanyl is also part of the equation. The fentanyl crisis has caused thousands upon thousands of deaths in the United States. Mexican cartels are heavily involved, and China has likely played a role as well. There have been allegations that China allowed precursor chemicals used to manufacture fentanyl to flow through, effectively turning a blind eye and contributing to the crisis. Some describe this as a very subtle form of Chinese soft power, fueling the fentanyl crisis indirectly through cartel networks. While this operation is being viewed as historic and largely positive, in places like Puerto Vallarta and in Jalisco, people remain on high alert.
Are we at risk of seeing more acts of retaliation from the cartel in response to what just happened?
With Trump, we can assume there will be other operations of this kind. That said, as I was saying earlier, this is already quite an achievement. You have to understand that the current Mexican administration, President Claudia Sheinbaum's government, has a reputation for being pacifist. Since 2018, Morena, the left-wing party that came to power with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has followed what in Spanish is called abrazos no balazos, which means hugs, not bullets. It has essentially been a policy of non-intervention in the war against the cartels. In other words, a policy of letting things be. That approach has been applied by the Mexican government since 2018, and it has not worked, unfortunately. Now, it's complicated because when a government in Latin America declares war on the cartels often respond with almost military-level force. That creates an escalation. So one can understand why Latin American governments may want to avoid escalation that would generate even more violence. But despite that, the strategy has not worked at all. So it was nonetheless a success of the Trump administration to have pressured Andrés Manuel López Obrador's administration, and now his successor, Ms. Sheinbaum, into finally intervening with the necessary force. So once again, this is still Donald Trump's shadow. In a way, it was a success for Donald Trump. And I think analysts will eventually have to acknowledge that. At least in Quebec, we'll see what our analysts say. But Trump has had geopolitical successes.
Do you think this type of operation would have been possible without Trump?
No, I don't think this would have been possible. At least not on this scale. And we've learned that the United States collaborated closely in this operation. Obviously, there was intelligence sharing at a technical level. We don't yet know all the details. But without Trump, under Biden and Andrés Manuel López Obrador just a few years ago, I don't think such an operation would even have been considered. Because we are talking about significant reprisals. For now, we're seeing things like burned buildings, mostly symbolic acts, a kind of backlash, how to put it, almost an adolescent-style rebellion, with cartels setting things on fire because their leader has died. There's something almost adolescent about it. It somewhat resembles riots in urban neighborhoods, although the comparison isn't exact. But no, I believe it was U.S. pressure that made the difference.
By removing the leader, could the cartel simply continue operating with a new leader despite everything?
Yes, of course, with the cartels, you cut off one head and 8 more appear, unfortunately. So this is not the end of drug trafficking in Mexico, nor in Latin America. And the great paradox is that Mexican cartels are armed with American weapons. This has been known for years. Many of the weapons they use, even military-grade firearms, are manufactured in the United States. Recently, we learned that this particular cartel had weapons originally intended for the U.S. military. So for Americans, it's not entirely coherent to allow weapons to cross the border on one hand, and on the other hand, claim they want to defeat the cartels. That is not a coherent policy. Mexico has been reminding the United States of this for years. It's complicated. Then there's the issue of routes. The real question is, where does the cocaine pass through? Ever since the United States shut down the maritime route, cocaine has had to pass through Mexico to reach the U.S. That's when Mexico became so dangerous, when it became the main cocaine corridor. If cocaine finds alternative routes, perhaps the problem will simply shift elsewhere. But it's not easy. Having Mexico on the U.S. border is a major challenge. Canadians don't really grasp the constant pressure of having a partially failed state next door, with paramilitary groups, the cartels, often equipped with heavy weaponry. El Mencho was known for that. There was a famous video circulating a few years ago in which he displayed what looked like tanks. That video caused a major sensation in Mexico, not in a positive way. These were men equipped with military gear and clearly motivated to control entire territories. And that is still the case. So this is not the end of drug trafficking. But perhaps there will be a reconfiguration that may be more favorable in terms of protecting both American and Mexican security interests.
We know there has been a warning issued to American travelers, advising them not to go out for safety reasons. Is there a possibility that the cartel could target American tourists? Since this...
It's a hypothesis that perhaps needs to be considered. We know that it has already happened before that cartels have executed foreign nationals. After that, it depends. What orders will ultimately be given to all these thugs? It depends on their outlook. If cartels were to make examples of American or Canadian citizens, that would take things to another level. They would certainly have to expect possibly even more direct U.S. intervention. At the same time, they are very audacious. Narcos are guys who have nothing to lose. They're guys who drink 2 40-ounce bottles a day. Listen, it's a different vision of life. We've already seen cartels fire at border agents along the U.S.-Mexico border. So anything is possible. But at the same time, I think the situation will settle down within a few days. However, as a foreigner, one must be cautious. Especially since, and this is another issue, Americans are driving up prices significantly in Mexico, and there is also a popular economic resentment. It's not necessarily related to narcos, but it may not be the best time for Westerners to be in Mexico.
La única forma de solucionar un problema que ya existe de inseguridad es con fuerza, con la fuerza del Estado, que yo lo he dicho en otras ocasiones, todo Estado es más fuerte que sus grupos criminales presentes en su territorio. No hay Estado que no pueda contra los criminales. Si un Estado no vence a la criminalidad es porque el Estado es cómplice o porque partes del Estado son cómplices. Una vez el Estado se libera de la complicidad con la delincuencia y va con fuerza hacia los criminales, los vence.
We have already discussed this, but considering what Nayib Bukele did in El Salvador, and I know you said it would be impossible for Mexico to do the same due to its population size and territory, with U.S. assistance, could something similar become possible?
In Mexico, it would be very difficult. Many Mexicans hope for a president with that same tough, iron fist policy. But we're talking about two different realities. El Salvador has, I believe, fewer than 8 million inhabitants. Mexico has 130 million people over a vastly larger territory. It is much more complicated to control a large population across a huge territory than a small population in a small country. So I have difficulty seeing how a Bukelization of security in Mexico could work. It's a scenario that has even been discussed elsewhere, for example in Ecuador. The term comes up often. Bukele is currently fashionable among Latin American leaders. They're observing what's happening in El Salvador. But is it realistic? Mexico is also a federation, like Canada. One of its official names is the United Mexican States, along with the Mexican Republic. So it is highly decentralized in a way. How do you rally all those governors around the same firm vision and the same repressive will against the cartels? That was much easier in El Salvador, where one man operates over a concentrated territory with a much smaller population. I struggle to see how the same policy could be applied in Mexico.
Es importante que sepan que se mantiene de todas maneras el día de hoy un centro de mando, una coordinación nacional, en donde está el secretario, están los 3 secretarios, sus equipos, la Secretaría de Gobernación para estar en coordinación con todos los gobiernos de los estados. Quiero hacer un reconocimiento especial a la Defensa Nacional, al general Ricardo Trevilla Trejo, al Ejército Mexicano, a la Guardia Nacional, a la Fuerza Aérea. Realmente México tiene fuerzas armadas extraordinarias.
How do we explain that this cartel was able to grow in power and operate for more than 20 years with impunity?
Many factors are involved. Narco trafficking is an economy in its own right. Normally, the city of Guadalajara, particularly the airport, was said to be paralyzed. But apparently, on television, they're telling us that flights are still taking off. I think there is some disinformation. It's not a term I use often, but right now, a huge number of images are circulating. We saw scenes suggesting an attack at the Guadalajara airport. Yet at the same time, official television says everything is fine. So some of the images circulating are false. We have to remain cautious every time. It's the same with the capture of Maduro. Many fake images circulated there too. So, are the cartels themselves spreading false images? Is the Mexican government spreading them? That's also possible. It's always a war of narratives.
Está circulando mucha información falsa en redes sociales y grupos de WhatsApp. Incluso imágenes manipuladas y generadas con inteligencia artificial que no corresponden a hechos reales y que son compartidas miles de veces. Esta desinformación genera miedo que se propaga con facilidad.
What explains the grip of narcos in Mexico at this level? First, the well-known policy of the left-wing Mexican government, Morena, Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional. This hands-off approach that has greatly contributed not just to the rise, but to the consolidation of narco groups. If you do not repress criminals, criminals will proliferate. It's very simple. So you have to return to proven methods, crack down on crime, while avoiding an escalation that leads to even more violence. That's the challenge. You cannot simply turn a blind eye. But it's extremely complicated. The connections are infinitely complex, the entanglements unimaginable, the levels of corruption unimaginable. The Mexican administration itself is suspected, in part, of perhaps having ties with at least one cartel. Can one even govern Mexico with clean hands? Perhaps pragmatically, that's impossible. The alliance dynamics are extremely complex, and narco trafficking is an economy in itself. We must not forget the U.S. factor either. Who consumes the cocaine? Hollywood, New York, etc. As long as Americans continue snorting cocaine endlessly, there will be American demand. So it is also up to Americans to stop using cocaine. There has been American complacency as well. Yes, Trump, but we just had the Epstein scandal. Everything that Americans, that Westerners have allowed, these elites who not only consume cocaine, but in some cases exploit children. You see what I mean? We cannot think Western countries are completely innocent. Americans inevitably bear part of the responsibility in narco trafficking.
What is the feeling of Mexicans? Are they happy of this bilateral operation? Are they happy that Trump and the U.S. got involved? How Mexicans feel about it?
Mexicans are deeply scarred by the violence. They can no longer bear it. There are many disappeared persons. The cartels are responsible, roughly speaking, for around 300,000 missing people. That's practically the size of the city of Quebec gone. Again, as I said, forced labor, slavery. These are groups that everyone in society hates. So a large portion of Mexican society will rejoice at the capture of this criminal. There's no doubt about that. But then there's always the issue of respecting Mexico's sovereignty. Mexicans are very proud and very nationalist, more so than Canadians. They do not want Americans interfering directly in their institutions. Granted, they have lost a significant amount of control due to corruption. But there is always this somewhat ambivalent discourse. President Sheinbaum plays heavily on that, repeating that Mexico is a sovereign country and will not allow Americans to interfere directly. Yet we just witnessed a bilateral operation, so clearly the Mexicans yielded somewhat to American pressure. But to return to the population, aside from the people of Jalisco, who are currently experiencing the repercussions, I would say that people generally rejoice at the elimination of a drug trafficker.
At Rebel News, we don't receive any money from the government, so if you want to help us to continue to do our independent journalism, you can chip in what you can at rebelfieldreports.com, and thank you in advance not only to support us, but also to share our content. Thanks.